Hi, this is Dr. Palmer again, and this is lesson 8.2, Measuring Public Opinion. Vocabulary you're going to need to know in this lesson is mandate, interest group, public opinion poll, straw vote, sample, random sample, and quota sample. How many times have you heard this phrase? According to a recent poll. Probably more than you can count, especially in the months leading up to an important election. Polls are one of the most common means of gauging public opinion. If public policy is to reflect public opinion, one needs to be able to find the answers to these questions. What are people's opinions on a particular issue? How many people share a given view on that issue? How firmly do they hold that view? In other words, there must be a way to measure public opinion. The general shape of public opinion on an issue can be found throughout a variety of means. These include voting, lobbying, books, pamphlets, magazines and newspaper articles, editorial comments in the press and on radio and television, paid advertisements, and letters to editors and public officials. These and other means of expression are the devices through which the general direction of public opinion becomes known. Usually, though, the means by which a view is expressed tells little, and often nothing reliable, about the size of the group that holds that opinion or how strongly it is held. In the American political system, this information is vital. To find this information, some effort must be made to measure public opinion. Elections, interest groups, the media, and personal contacts with the public all, at least to some degree, provide the means of measurement. In a democracy, the voice of the people is supposed to express itself through the ballot box. Election results are thus very often said to be indicators of public opinion. The votes cast for various candidates are regularly taken as evidence of the people's approval or rejection of the stands taken by those candidates and their parties. As a result, a party and its victorious candidates regularly claim to have received a mandate to carry out their campaign promises. In American politics, a mandate refers to the instructions or commands a constituency gives to its elected officials. In reality, however, election results are seldom an accurate measure of public opinion. Voters make choices in elections for any of several reasons, as you have seen. Very often, those choices have little or nothing to do with the candidate's stand on public questions. Then, too, candidates often disagree with some of the planks on their party's platform. In addition, candidates and the parties often express their positions in broad, vague terms. In short, much of what you have learned about voting behavior and about the nature of parties adds up to this. Elections are, at best, only useful indicators of public opinion. To call the typical election a mandate for much of anything other than a general direction in public policy is to be on very shaky ground. Interest groups are private organizations whose members share certain views and work to shape public policy. These organizations are also very aptly known as pressure groups and special interest groups. Interest groups are a chief means by which public opinion is made known. They present their views and exert their pressures through their lobbyists, by letters and telephone calls, in political campaigns, and by a number of other methods. In dealing with them, however, public officials often have difficulty determining two things: how many people does an interest group really represent, and just how strongly do those people hold the views that an organization say they hold. Earlier, you learned some very impressive numbers about television. Those huge numbers help describe the place the media in the public opinion process exists. You'll learn more of these numbers later. Here, recognize this point. The media are also a gauge for assessing public opinion. The media are frequently described as mirrors, as well as molders of opinion. It's often said that the views expressed in newspaper editorials, syndicated columns, news magazines, television commentaries, and so on are a fairly good indicator of public opinion. In fact, however, the media are not very accurate mirrors of public opinion, often reflecting only the views of a vocal minority. Most public officials have frequently and wide-ranging contacts in many different forms with large numbers of people. In each of these contacts, they try to read the public's mind. Indeed, their jobs demand that they do so. Members of Congress receive bags of mail and hundreds of phone calls and emails every day. Many of them make frequent trips to keep in touch with the folks back home. Top administration figures are often on the road, too, selling the president's program and gauging the people's reactions. Even the president does some of this, with speaking trips to different parts of the country. Governors, state legislators, mayors, and other officials also have any number of contacts with the public. These officials encounter the public in their offices, in public meetings, at social gatherings, and even at ball games. Can public officials find the voice of the people in all those contacts? Many can and do, and often with surprising accuracy. But some public officials cannot. They fall into an ever-present trap. They find that they want to find, and only what they want to find, and only those views that support and agree with their own views. Public opinion is best measured by public opinion polls, devices that attempt to collect information by asking people questions. The more accurate polls are based on scientific polling techniques. Public opinion polls have existed in this country for more than a century. Until the 1930s, however, they were far from scientific. Most early polling efforts were of the straw vote variety. That is, they were polls that sought to read the public's mind simply by asking the same question of a large number of people. Straw votes are still fairly common. Newspapers often run clip-out-and-mail ballots. Radio talk shows ask listeners to respond to questions with phone calls, internet polls, and so on. The straw vote technique is highly unreliable. It rests on the false assumption that a relatively large number of responses will provide a fairly accurate picture of the public's view on a given question. The problem is this: nothing in the process ensures that those who respond will represent a reasonably accurate cross-section of the total population. The straw vote emphasizes the quality rather than emphasizes the quantity rather than the quality of the sample to which its question is posed. The most famous of all straw polling mishaps took place in 1936. A periodic called the Literary Digest mailed postcard ballots to more than 10 million people and received answers from more than 2,376,000 of them. Based on that huge return, the magazine confidently predicted the outcome of the presidential election that year. It said that Governor Alfred Landon, the Republican nominee, would easily defeat incumbent Franklin Roosevelt. Instead, Roosevelt won in a landslide. He captured more than 60% of the popular vote and carried every state but Maine and Vermont. The Digest had drawn its sample on an altogether faulty basis, from automobile registration lists and telephone directories. The Digest had failed to consider that in the mid-Depression year of 1936, millions of people could not afford to own cars or to have private telephones. The Digest poll failed to reach most of the vast pool of the poor and unemployed, millions of blue-collar workers, and most of the ethnic minorities in the country. Those were the very segments of the population from which Roosevelt and the Democrats drew their greatest support. The magazine had predicted the winner of each of the 3 previous presidential elections, but its failure to do so in 1936 was so colossal that it ceased publication not long thereafter. Serious efforts to take the public's pulse on a scientific basis date from the mid-1930s. Attempts began with the work of such early pollsters as George Gallup and Elmo Roper. The techniques that they and others have developed since then have reached a highly sophisticated level. There are now more than 1,000 national and regional polling organizations in this country. Many of them do mostly commercial work. That is, they tap the public's preferences on everything from toothpaste and headache remedies to television shows and thousands of other things. However, at least 200 of these polling organizations also poll the public preferences of the American people. Among the best known of the national pollsters today are the Gallup Organization and Lewis Harris and Associates. Scientific poll-taking is an extremely complex process that can best be described in 5 basic steps. In their efforts to discover and report public opinion, pollsters must first 1. Define the universe to be surveyed, 2. Construct a sample, 3. Prepare valid questions, 4. Select and control how the poll will be taken, and 5. Analyze and report their findings to the public. The universe is a term that means the whole population that the poll means to measure. It is the group whose opinions the polls will seek to discover. That universe can be all voters in Chicago, or every high school student in Texas, or all Republicans in New England, or all Democrats in Georgia, or all Catholic women over age 35 in the United States, and so on. If a poll's universe is very small, say the 25 members of a high school class, the best way to find out what the universe thinks about some issue would be to poll every one of them. In most cases, however, it's not possible to interview a complete universe. This is certainly true in matters of public policy that affect all the people of the nation. There are simply too many people in that universe to talk to, so the pollsters must select a sample, a representative slice of the total universe. Most professional pollsters draw a random sample, also called a probability sample. In a random sample, the pollster interviews a certain number of randomly selected people who live in a certain number of randomly selected places. A random sample is thus a sample in which each member of the universe and each geographic area within it have a mathematically equal chance of being included. Each major national poll usually interviews just over 1,500 people to represent the universe of the entire nation's adult population. How can the views of so few people represent the opinions of so many? The answer to that question lies in the mathematical law of probability. Flip a coin 1,000 times. The law of probability says that, given an honest coin and an honest flip, heads will come up 500 times. Furthermore, the law states that the result of this test will be the same no matter how often you perform it, and no matter what kind of coin you use. The law of probability is regularly applied in a great many situations. It's used by insurance companies to compute life expectancies, by food inspectors to check the quality of a farmer's truckload of beans, and by others who play the odds, including pollsters who draw random samples. In short, if the sample is of sufficient size and is properly selected at random from the entire universe, the law of probability says that the results will be accurate to within a small and predictable margin of error. Mathematicians tell us that a properly drawn random sample of some 1,500 people will reflect the opinions of the nation's entire adult population and will be accurate to within a margin of plus or minus 3%. Pollsters acknowledge that it's impossible to construct a sample that would be an absolute accurate reflection of a large universe. Hence, the allowance for error. A margin of plus or minus 3% means a spread of 6 percentage points, of course. To reduce the sampling error from plus or minus 3% to plus or minus 1%, the size of the sample would have to be 9,500 people. The time and money needed to interview so big a sample size makes that a practical impossibility. Some pollsters use less complicated but less reliable sampling methods. They draw on a quota sample, a sample deliberately constructed to reflect several of the major characteristics of a given universe. For example, if 51.3% of a universe is female, 17.5% of it is African American, and so on, then the quota sample will be made up of 51.3% females, 17.5% African Americans, and so on. Of course, most of the people in the sample will belong to more than one category. This fact is a major reason why such a sample is less reliable than random samples. The way in which questions are worded is very important. Wording can affect the reliability of any poll. For example, most people will probably say yes to this question put this way: should local taxes be reduced? Many of those same people will also answer yes to this question: should the city's police force be increased to fight the rising tide of crime in our community? Yet expanding the police force also certainly would require more local tax dollars. Responsible pollsters acknowledge these issues and thus phrase their questions very carefully. They purposely try not to use loaded, emotionally charged words or terms that are difficult to understand. They also try to avoid questions that are worded in a way that will tend to shape the answers that are given to them. How the pollsters communicate with the sample respondents can also affect accuracy. Some polls are taken face-to-face. That is, the interviewers question the respondents in person. However, pollsters conduct an increasing number of surveys by telephone, by mail, and on the internet. Professional pollsters see both advantages and drawbacks to each of these approaches. They all agree, however, that whichever technique they use to gather information, they must employ the same technique in questioning all the respondents in a sample. The interview itself is a very sensitive point in the process. The pollster's appearance, dress, attitude, tone of voice in asking questions, all can influence the replies he or she receives, and thus alter the validity of the poll's results. If the questions are not carefully worded, some of the respondents' replies may be snap judgments or emotional reactions. Others may be answers that the person being interviewed thinks ought to be given, or there may be replies the respondent thinks will please or offend the interviewer. Thus, polling organizations try to hire and train their interviewing staffs very carefully. Polls, whether scientific or not, try to measure people's attitudes. To be of any real value, however, someone must analyze and report the results. Scientific polling organizations today collect huge amounts of raw data. In order to handle this data, computers and other electronic hardware have become routine parts of the process. Pollsters use these technologies to tabulate and interpret their data, draw their conclusions, and then publish their findings. How good are polls? On balance, the major national polls are fairly reliable. So too are most of the regional surveys around the country. Still, they are far from perfect. Fortunately, most responsible pollsters themselves are quite aware of that fact and readily acknowledge the limits of their polls. Many of them are involved in continuing efforts to refine every aspect of the polling process. Pollsters know that they have difficult efforts in measuring the intensity, stability, and reliance of the opinions they report. Intensity is the strength of feeling with which an opinion is held. Stability, or fluidity, is the relative permanence or changeability of an opinion. Relevance, or salience, is how important a particular opinion is to the person who holds it. Another potential problem is that polls and pollsters are sometimes said to shape the opinions that they're supposed to measure. Some critics of polls say that in an election, for example, pollsters often create a bandwagon effect. That is, some voters wanting to be the winner jump on the bandwagon of the candidate who's ahead in the polls. This charge is most often levied against those polls that appear as syndicated columns in many newspapers. In spite of these criticisms, it is clear that scientific polls are the most useful tools there are for the difficult task of measuring public opinion. Although they may not be always or precisely accurate, they do offer reasonably reliable guides to public thought. Moreover, they help to focus attention on public questions and to stimulate discussions about them. More than a century ago, the Englishman Lord Bryce described government in the United States as government by public opinion. Clearly, the energy devoted to measuring public opinion in this country suggests something of its powerful role in American politics. However, Lord Bryce's observations is true only if it's understood to mean that public opinion is the major, but by no means the only, influence on public policy in this country. Its force is tempered by a number of other factors, for example by interest groups. More importantly, however, remember that our system of constitutional government is not designed to give free, unrestricted play to public opinion, and especially not to majority opinion. In particular, the doctrines of separation of power, of checks and balances, and constitutional guarantees of civil rights and liberties are intended to protect minority interests against the excesses of majority views and actions. Finally, polls are not elections, nor are they substitutes for elections. It's when faced with a ballot that voters must decide what is important and what is not. Voters must be able to tell the difference between opinions and concrete information, and should know the difference between personalities and platforms. Democracy is more than a simple measure of opinion. Democracy is about making careful choices among leaders and their positions on issues, and among the governmental actions that may follow. Ideally, democracy is the thoughtful participation of citizens in the political process.